Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode 238. I knew it for once. 238. And this week we're going to be talking about the radio room, the second coach in the train. But, of course, this footage here is part of Under Construction, which came out at about the same time. And I will cover the technical difficulty right now, even though you can go to the very beginning of that video and see it. I made the mistake of muting Tane, because I didn't want to hear the annoying sheep and the mill running all the time. And apparently that sort of sets the bar for all of the other sound that Bandicam will pick up, because Bandicam is tied to the window that you're recording, which in this case was the train's window. So it muted everything else. I had Mason on the show. Normally it wouldn't have been nearly as bad, but I did have Mason on the show. So you have a conversation, you have an episode with me talking to nobody. So I apologize for that, and I feel like I should go through and explain a little bit, but this show is not for that. I'll talk about it more on next Under Construction, probably. If there's any questions. I encourage people to ask questions on that one. Anyways. This is episode 238, Converting Coaches, number 2, the radio room, spurred on by a question by Dean on episode 209, which was how do you convert the coaches to what they needed to be? How long did it take to convert just one? I covered some basics last time, but the radio room is probably a little bit more niche, because it's a little bit more specific in what it was used for, and as well, it was very much a center of power for the train, and I mean that literally. The battery bank, which was one of the centerpieces of the room, even though, it's in the corner, it's on the side, it takes up like a quarter of the length of the coach, and it's mounted on the wall, or it's at the wall. And it's only about as deep as a desk. But the battery bank was an array of batteries that we'd salvaged from cars. And it was finicky. I'll cover that much. But let's go back to the beginning. I talk about the finickiness of the battery bank and some other things. So, back to the beginning. We had the coach. The radio room was one of the first ones where we were like, okay, we need a dedicated coach for this. And we have equipment, and we need a place to put it. So we started piling in the second coach, and it very slowly came together as, okay, we've got a desk. We're going to put some stuff on the desk. We have this computer. We're going to put this computer on the desk. We have all these radio receivers that we're picking up, like scanners and shortwave radios, ham radios, FM, AM receivers. We couldn't do that much transmitting on those bands because we didn't really have a large and powerful antenna. Most of what we did was shortwave. But the idea was, okay, we've got this radio room, or we've got this area where we have a lot of our radio equipment, and we started putting it together. So, we set up the stuff, we tied it together, and it very slowly became this sort of knotted together assemblage of computerized parts, and it was, by far the largest electricity consumer on the entire train was the radio room, but it was also the thing that enabled us to really keep going. So, with this desk about halfway up the coach, we had the computer on it, we had all of the other radio controls on it, but then behind it, there was some more stuff. It was sort of an L-shaped desk. And then behind it, like behind the computer stuff, we had all of the cabinets with things like records of frequencies, records of transmissions. We had a little a transcriber, which was something that was a little bit jury-rigged into the system and didn't work all that well, but it was useful in sort of emergency situations. We had effectively an answering machine, which was a reel-to-reel recorder that we'd let run all the time, and when nobody was manning the radio, and then you'd go back and you'd listen to it at like 4 times or 8 times speed in the morning, or while you're doing nothing else throughout the day, so you can catch if there were any important transmissions overnight. This was during Zombie Train days. This was actually really, really important during Zombie Train days. Because, we didn't know necessarily when people were going to contact us. And we did have an emergency frequency But that's outside of the scope of what I'm trying to talk about. I'm trying to talk about the coach itself. The interior was left kind of bare. Other than, we had some shelves, we had the desk, we had a small table that was adjacent to the desk for little write-ups and stuff like that. Opposite that was the battery bank, or, opposite corner. What else was in there? The roof had a whole bunch of antennas. And that was an issue. These were antennas. We actually, at one point, we cut a giant hole in the ceiling. And we had to build this framework around the sides of the car, the inside of the car, to support this thing because we got a little weather radar. And it was off of like a pleasure boat. An ocean-going pleasure boat. And it was really good for sort of tracking, it was good for exactly what its purpose was. It was good for tracking weather. GPS largely remained functional, although it fell a little bit out of sync. It became a little bit unreliable when we got a GPS receiver as well, so we could mark our exact position. And that all came up in there because it would come up on the computer screen. That was the only computer screen we had. It was the only screen, I think, except for in the lounge. It was the only screen we had on the entire train. And so if there was anything computerized, you'd have to go through there. We had, like, satellite dishes. But yeah, that just sort of fell together. The radio room was not planned. Not by any stretch. It sort of, it started with an assemblage of components that was in the same room, that we started to realize, hey, we really need to use these. We can really use these for our own purposes. And so we started using them, and then, of course, we weren't going to pick them up and move them elsewhere, so the radio room just became the second car on the train. Or, the second car on the train became the radio room. Because so much went on in there, and because the electricity stuff was a little prone to failure, that's the other thing, that's where we kept, like, a quarter of our fire extinguishers total were in that room. Because that was a lot of problems. We had a lot of these conduits that were on the walls. The other thing that was in there, actually, and I don't know how, I sort of whiffed on this for a while. Next to the table, across from the battery bank, was the generator. And this was a larger, not like a, obviously not like a hospital generator, but like a larger household generator that we would use to charge the battery bank when it was there. And this was one of the last things to go in, except for the battery bank itself. So originally, the power would come from the dynamo and the engine, although that started to be a little bit lacking. So we started to get car batteries, and we'd have to step them up and run stuff with them, and they wouldn't last all that long, but we'd be able to recharge them because we would take them into the caboose and run them on a charger which was powered by a little motor which had a belt that was wrapped around one of the axles of the caboose. So that worked for a little while. It would tend to come loose if we did a lot of tight, fast turns. So, we built like a tensioner to it, which was incredibly jury-rigged, but it worked most of the time. And that's how we'd recharge the batteries. And so when you'd stop, you'd take a couple of batteries, you'd take them to the caboose, and you'd trade them out with ones that had been sitting on the charger. And Johnny, who ran the caboose, who was our rear-end conductor, or, rear-end brakeman, or whatever you want to call him. We called him the conductor. That wasn't really accurate. But he would be in charge of swapping those batteries out when they were full. So, then they'd get taken back up there and then be used to power the equipment when we needed it. And then the dynamo would run the lower-level equipment, like the shortwave. And then we realized that, hey, listen, hey, we can grab this generator here and use it on the fly. And it didn't have a very large gasoline reservoir, and we needed a very large gasoline reservoir, and the gasoline was way towards the end of the train in a tank car. So we built one into the ceiling, which was another reason we kept a lot of fire extinguishers in there, because it was not perfect. First of all, to fill it, you had to climb on top of the coach. Second of all, it took up like half of the length of the upper section of the coach. Half is exaggerated, maybe like a third. It was right next to the battery bank, which was a bad decision, but we built the reservoir before we built the battery bank, and there was no other room for the battery bank, except for in that corner across from the generator. So, we had this giant leaky tank of gasoline. So we had the giant leaky tank of gasoline and the generator, which we got in there by taking part of the wall out. And that was one of the most destructive things we've ever had to do to a coach. So, the electronics were all set up, they were being powered by these couple of batteries that were stuffed under the thing, and we have to remove like a 5 or 6 foot section long of wall to muscle this thing, turn it sideways, get it into the coach, put it in, turn it the right way, and slide it back against the wall that was missing, and then we built the wall again, with no windows, I don't think. I don't think we put the windows back in that initially. We might have later. But, initially what we did was we actually put ventilation fans in those spaces where the windows would have been. And so that coach had a lot of circulation of air, and it would get very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer, because you needed to circulate the air for, we needed to pipe the exhaust of the generator out when the generator was running. We needed to clear out the gas fumes, which would slowly build up, because we don't want the whole thing to explode. And we had a couple of scares. We had a couple of little kabooms, but nothing really destructive. Just a couple of flashes. And we didn't really have a better way to do that. We wanted to build a wall between one half of the coach and the other, like where the radio woman, my mom, was sitting, and where the generator and battery bank were. But the problem with that was then you wouldn't be able to realize if there was a fire immediately and put it out before it got too big. So that was decided as a no, and occasionally my mom would take to wearing sort of a mask, almost like a gas mask, but like a hospital mask when the fumes would start to get too bad. So then we devised a better ventilation system with sort of with actual vents that were hanging from the ceiling, and so it would just channel the air down the coach. It would bring it in from the front of the coach, past the computer and radios, past her, so she'd get some fairly fresh air, and then out the back of the coach, so with the fumes and everything else out in that direction. So that was better, and that's when we put the windows back in, because we didn't need the ventilation fans right there. And then we had the generator for a while, and we were realizing, okay, we've got a pretty good-sized reservoir space. What should we do with this extra power that we're generating? And it was like, well, we can store it in the batteries. Okay, that'd be really good. We don't have enough batteries, and we also don't have an easy way to change them out. So Emilio and I set to designing this battery bank, which held, I think, 24 batteries, and was just mounted up. And it had an automatic relay, so when the thing hit a certain point, when the current dropped too much for feeding into the batteries, it would turn the generator off. This was all like analog logic. This was some fun jerry-rigged stuff. And it would turn the generator off, and it would switch over to discharge mode. So the train would start running on battery power. Now you can manipulate a lot of that manually, but that's what it was set up for. That's what it initially did. So that was the radio room, and that was sort of how everything went together. Again, the battery bank was fairly late, but in terms of stuff in the radio room, but in terms of the zombie train itself, it was not all that late. That was one of the first coaches to really get a makeover, and it showed, and it showed because it had absolutely no concern for aesthetics or anything like that, and oh my god! And I'm not an electrician, and Emilio's certainly not an electrician, and my dad has done electrical work, but he's not an electrician either, and my Uncle Paul, not really an electrician either, and some of the stuff that we had to put together was just, it looked deranged. You'd have cables hanging from areas, you'd have pipes that were sort of mounted, you'd have these transformers that were just nestled under the desk that would get very, very hot. Those never burst into flames somehow, but just to convert from what we were using, which is like the 12 volt output of a car battery, to the 12 volt DC output of a car battery to an AC back and forth 120 volts. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next week. Train Man out.